and welcome to the next episode of Policyverse. I am Vriti, joined by my colleague Pranay. Today, we'll be discussing an issue that is well known but perhaps not adequately understood, and that is the functioning of our legislatures. Often on our television screens, we see legislators rabble-rousing, bills getting passed without legislative oversight. There is no quality debate or discussion happening. Is it the issue or is it a symptom of a much deeper problem? Today, to discuss all of this, we have with us Dr. JP. Welcome, Dr. JP.
Thank you, Riti.
It is a common understanding that the legislative branch of the state, from where the executive is drawn, is more powerful in overseeing the implementation of policies, controlling the ministers, ensuring that the opinions of the electorate are adequately represented. However, what we see in India is that the legislature has become timid, executive has become too strong, and judiciary too arrogant. What is your take on the utility of legislatures in the current setup?
Priti, legislature is vital for the simple reason that that's the only source of legitimacy to the whole governance process. What is democracy? That the will of the people is what governs. It is a rule of the people either directly by themselves or through their elected representatives. And the only body elected in the country or the only functionaries elected in the country are the legislators. Therefore, the question of legislature not being relevant does not arise, because the moment you make legislature irrelevant, there is no democracy. But the problem is, as you outlined, we are using legislature only for the limited constitutional purpose that there must be a legislative election, that the government will be drawn from the legislature with the majority support of the legislature, and it collapses when the majority withdraws support. To that very limited extent, we understood the Constitution. Therefore, the whole politics is about how do I get a majority in the legislature, either through the election process, by persuading the people, by bribing the people, by emotionally arousing the people, or by buying MLAs, by buying MPs, by all kinds of strategies to somehow manufacture a majority. That is one part. The second part, how do I sustain the government or bring down the government? Ethical, unethical, right, wrong, national interest, no, it's irrelevant on both sides. So unfortunately, our democracy therefore is limited only to somehow getting the legislative majority and maintaining the legislative majority, not about the purpose of democracy and about the content of democracy. And that's why we see all these perversions. And as you said rightly, the body that creates the government, that body that actually gives legitimacy to whole governance process, is the body that is least relevant in ultimate governance in the country. It's not a very good situation.
So you just mentioned that legislature's primary function is to legislate laws. And the fact that it is very important is because it carries the will of the people. The common understanding here is that the will of the people is carried by the ruling party, but that is not the case. Fundamentally, the will of the people is also carried by private members. And for this, first, I'd like to draw a parallel between UK and India. UK and India have had a common history, and that is why the political setup of UK and India is somewhat similar. But if you have to consider the private member bills, in last 100 years, where you see that 229 private member bills have been discussed, debated and passed in UK, the situation in India is very alarming and concerning. In India, out of 314, I think somewhere around only 14 bills have been discussed, debated and passed. That is merely 4% of the bills that have been introduced. So why do you think that there is such a difference between the system of UK and India, despite the roots being similar?
There are two levels at which we should examine this. To be fair, even in the UK, the parliament, which is the mother of parliaments, which creates the government, has increasingly become less important in legislation. Unlike in other democracies, take the United States, the legislature owns legislation. Legislature owns the budget process at the state level or at the national level, federal level. And legislature is really in command, and it is perhaps the first organ of state. It is the most powerful branch of the state, not the executive. Whereas in India and in the UK, the executive is more powerful than the legislature. First, let's understand that. As long as the executive commands the majority support in the legislature. With that caveat. Once we have that majority support, executive is always in command. Historically, in British democracy, in the Westminster model, The legislation proposal and its piloting has shifted from the legislature to the executive. As an allowance, private members are given space. And it's taken seriously, as opposed to India. Similarly, historically, the budget process, which ought to be the legislature's property, in fact, the whole fight between the king and the parliament was about control in terms of making laws and in terms of making the budget and expenditure. It has shifted to the government because, after all, government is derived from the legislature. It commands the majority in the legislature. Therefore, government is the one that proposes expenditure. Legislature merely discusses and votes on it, does not initiate. Again, contrary to American experience. In the US, the budget is the property of the legislature. And there is enormous negotiation, discussion, all kinds of work going on in the legislature. From there, it goes to the executive. The executive does propose some elements, but ultimately it's legislature's property. So, to be fair, the Westminster model that we have adopted, both in Britain and in India, and perhaps other countries which embrace the same model, the initiative has shifted from the legislature to executive. In India, it has gone in the extreme form. Because in Britain, there is respect for tradition and the fundamentals, the first principles of democracy. Therefore, the parliamentary supremacy is understood. And that's why, you have the Prime Minister's question hour. Very brief but very pointed questions are asked and very quick and effective responses. Similarly, the private member's time. Third, any member, the member does not feel that her voice is silenced. And fourth, while parties give a whip and all that, there's no disqualification. You may quit the party. In fact, the only punishment that the party can impose on an erring member is removing the whip, that basically saying you are not part of my legislature party. So giving them even more freedom. The only risk is electoral. Supposing the people don't like you switching from this party to being an independent, then they may vote you out. Or if they like your stand, they may vote you in. So party is not removing you from politics, unlike in India. Whereas in India, what happened? A, the anti-defection law. B, the undemocratic party organization. Parties controlled by individuals and families. There's no ownership of the party by the members. And C, the large constituencies in an illiterate country with highly centralized power. Large, illiterate, centralized. Together is a deadly combination. Therefore, the candidate's merit is hardly of any relevance. Whereas in Britain, there are small constituencies, highly literate population. Though it's a unitary country, increasingly now it's a federal country, but even in unitary system, they had strong local governments. So with those things, the power of the party is not so oppressive that individual leaders' caliber is irrelevant. In India, it's increasingly irrelevant. Therefore, the members are desperate to please the party bosses. On top of it, you have the anti-defection law. A combination of all these means that individual members politically become irrelevant. If you deviate from the party's diktats, then they will not even nominate you in the next election. Without getting nominated by a party, getting the symbol of the party, you almost certainly have no political future. In the 1950s, when the party system was not so entrenched, though Congress was already a very strong party with roots, but still it was a loose kind of a system. About 50 plus members of the Lok Sabha, they were independents. And the Speaker Maulankar, though he was a congressman, acted in every sense of the time as an independent until the end of his political and personal life. Similarly, in states, large number of independents. Today, without a party, you almost have no political future. So it's a combination of all this. That's why FDR, the Foundation of Democratic Reforms, where we sit, has been instrumental in pushing or piloting significant legislative and even constitutional changes in the country. But we never depended on a private member's will, because that is a death knell. The moment you ask a private member to propose something, that means it's guaranteed to fail. It's doomed to failure. Therefore, always we dealt with the key decision makers in government and in opposition, and the key parliamentarians and others, and persuaded them with the logic of it and the political argument why it should be taken up from their point of view. And in some cases we succeeded, some cases we failed. But in India, an individual member independently taking it up without a major political party sponsoring it or owning it, the chance of success is next to zero.
So you just made a mention of G.V. Malvankar, the first speaker. And there's another practice in UK, that is the Speaker of the House is appointed from non-ruling party. And that is probably a
Generally, not universally, but
Informal
oftentimes,
arrangement.
in fact, Margaret Thatcher tried to deviate from the principle. Her own party senior leader, Edward Heath, former Prime Minister, said no. We must give a chance to the opposition party. And not only that, the Speaker, once appointed, as long as the Speaker wants, that is a position for his political or her political life. And the Speaker is not any longer a member of the party. The Speaker never goes back to a party. If the Speaker contests elections again, contests as independent, other parties do not put up a candidate. He is elected unanimously. So they have formed, none of this is by law. These are customs almost with the status of law. Unfortunately, even in the UK, on occasion, there is a breach of one or two of these principles. And party's discipline is such that, and sense of fairness is such that, if somebody, a member of, let's say, one party is not able to attend the parliament for no fault of hers, sick, stranded somewhere, in a vital vote, a member of the other party refrains from voting. Because parliamentary decisions are not about who is managing to come to the parliament, who is running first. It's about reasoned debate and your honest views.
So the arrangements that you've just cited that are prevalent in United Kingdom, why do you think that we have failed to institutionalize such arrangements in India? Because as I just mentioned that the history is common. So for us, everything was new. Why did we not institutionalize those kind of arrangements in India? Where did we go wrong?
It's a good question. Molankar acted exactly the way a speaker should act, British practice. And our leaders respected his role. But perhaps they were also uncomfortable on occasion because you have a majority in the legislature, but the speaker has become a stumbling block. So it's possible that while they sort of tolerated it, they were not particularly enamored by that. Second, in Britain, it was not the rules and the laws. It's the traditions sanctified over time. Britain does not even have a constitution. It doesn't mean it doesn't have a constitution. There is no written constitution. There is a Supreme Court, which actually can hold a law invalid. That means even though unwritten, there is a code which is broadly accepted by the judiciary and by the political system and the country as inviolable. That means it's almost like a constitution. In India, though the constitution is there, what is not mentioned in the constitution, we never bother to internalize that and create traditions and rules. And therefore, almost anything passes. If it's not explicitly mentioned in the constitution, then I don't have to worry about it. Oftentimes, I suspect, even what is explicitly mentioned doesn't really matter. Take, for instance, some debates in some states. Article 176 says that the governor shall address the first session of the new assembly, and thereafter every first session in the new calendar year. Well, there are some states where the governors are not allowed to address by various stratagems. It's not done. It is clearly implied that an ordinance power is only meant for emergencies when the House is not in session. But umpteen times you see what is happening in this country. So only to the extent that it's absolutely vital for running politics, namely getting the majority elected or manufacturing a majority by other means and sustaining a government or bringing down government. And because without the parliament or the legislature, you cannot formally enact a law. You can only have ordinances up to a point, not every hour. If that's possible, they would do that too. And only to the extent that budget has to be approved by the legislature. Otherwise, I think we don't think democratic practice is important in this country, and we are giving it the go by increasingly. Look at the number of days legislatures meet. There are states where 15 days they meet, 21 days. In Britain, typically 150 days, 200 days. It's almost continuously in session, because that is the organ that derives legitimacy from the people. And therefore, unless the issues are in the public domain, debated honestly and in detail, in a lucid manner, where is democracy? In our country, because the Constitution again says there shall not be a gap of more than 180 days between two sessions, therefore, the legislature is meeting. The executive is compelled to summon the legislature, but only for that 1 day, 2 days, 3 days. Therefore, the total duration of the legislature, the sessions are only 10, 12, 15 days. And those days also, half the time is lost in shouting, getting into the well, and then walking out, and things of that sort. So we made it a notional democracy in many ways. We reduced it to voting and shouting, not reasoned debate, not legislative supremacy, not reconciliation of conflicting interests, not looking at the long-term interests of the society even as we protect the short-term requirements. So it's become a quest for power without a purpose. That is at the heart of the crisis.
Sir, I would like to pick two strands from your earlier answer. So, I think I wouldn't be wrong if I say that the role of the legislator is merely saying yay and nay in the legislature, right? So, and on the other side, we also see that the quality of debate in the legislatures has diminished, and you have rightly pointed that it is because the parties have to appease to the constituencies. So, do you think that separation of powers, as you know, it is practiced in the US, is a way forward, keeping all else equal?
I believe so. At the state level. I don't think it's worthwhile at the national, because no system is perfect for any country. Every country is unhappy with the system it has chosen. For instance, in America, the federal legislature, the Congress, can almost never make a law unless both houses are also controlled by the president's party. Right now, the American lower house, House of Representatives, a slim Republican majority is there. And therefore, the president cannot get any legislation through. Even the upper house, they have strict rules, which they can change if they wish, but they're not changing it, of a majority of 60 to get anything through. So if you have a majority in the house, doesn't mean that you can get a law made. Now, what it means is there is a permanent paralysis in the federal government. Now, that apart, in India, the danger at the national level is, if a president is seen to be the symbol of the state, though there is no real power, American president, as we have seen, actually has much fewer powers than the president in Britain or India, because the prime minister in Britain or India. Because the prime minister in our country's Westminster model enjoys the legislative majority automatically, that is embedded in the system, and he or she is the head of the executive branch of government. Whereas in the US, is only the executive branch of government's head, and he has no control over legislature. Oftentimes, legislature doesn't bother at all what the president wants. Therefore, they're paralyzed. So in reality, the power of a prime minister in our system is greater than that of the president. But the symbolic nature of the presidency, 21-gun salute, you are the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, you get all the state functions, recognition, because this is all descendants of monarchy, remember. It is so great that people feel terrified. If all executive power is concentrated in one president, even if he has no legislative or budgetary power, the fear is that he or she may play favorites in a very complex and diverse country. Language, Hindi, non-Hindi. Religion, Hindu, Muslim, the great divides of India. Region, north, south. And therefore, my belief is at the national level, the balance of convenience lies in persevering with the current model, but with improvements. But at the state level, we have no such problems. If we clearly separate the executive from legislature, there will be enormous improvement in the quality of elections, quality of leadership, the day-to-day interference in administration, because even if a chief minister wants to govern well, and there are chief ministers who, for their own political reasons, are genuine commitment to public good, they actually want to govern well. But within a few months, there is dissidence. From where? Within your party. Why? You are ignoring the party cadres. Because you are applying principles of rule of law equally. If you apply principles of rule of law equally, what's the point of us being in power? We worked, we sacrificed, we voted, we made other people vote. We got power. Now we must get the spoils of power. That is our notion of power in this country. Now, therefore, even a well-meaning government or head of the government cannot function fairly in public interest, because legislators, if they are not appeased, the party cadres, if they are not appeased, the government actually will fall. So a separation of powers will certainly help. You can bring the fine talent from outside the legislature. One of the reasons why it's necessary is the legislator in India, at the state level in particular, but even at the national level, in their eyes, or in the eyes of the public and the media, it's not merely the legislators, is no longer a legislator. Much of our discussion so far is based on the notion that a legislator is a legislator. In India, a legislator is disguised executive. Because we did not allow local governments to take roots at all, Constitution paid lip sympathy in directive principles. There is no third tier of government. Once they came into existence and they were functioning somewhat well in some states and not very well in some other states, instead of encouraging that, we created a monstrous 73rd, 74th Amendment architecture, which overstructured and underpowered local governments. And even the good that is happening in some states is no longer possible because neither the states own it, nor is the structure conducive to good governance in the states. So right now, we have the weakest third tier of governments. So what happened? Day-to-day needs of people, street lighting, water supply, the street in front of the house, the traffic management locally, or the sewerage, or stormwater drainage, 100 other things, the people now expect legislator to somehow get them delivered. Now, legislator, what is his real power? He has no executive power. Therefore, you only use your nuisance value, your position every day. And therefore, a system, an ecosystem is now created in almost all states, irrespective of which party is governing, whereby a legislator is the uncrowned king of his constituency. Transfers, postings, your contracts and tenders, police cases, natural resources allocation, everything is entirely the MLA's preserve, particularly if she or he belongs to the ruling party, and to some extent even otherwise. Now that's why we are debating the role of legislature. Legislators are not debating the role. Have you realized it? They're not asking for this role. This debate is not coming from legislatures. It's coming from us from a broader democratic point of view. Legislators see themselves as the de facto monarchs of the constituency. And they don't want local governments to come up, even if some government is willing to allow them to take roots. So we have a very perverted system with all kinds of perverse incentives. And in order to correct that, it's not enough to simply have some rules in the legislature. We have to look at A, the systemic changes like, can you separate executive from legislature at the state level? B, can we empower local governments in an effective but accountable manner? Just because you create local governments in the current climate, let's not assume that the local government leaders will act in good faith in public interest. They will also abuse power. They will also buy the votes. They will also spend abnormal amounts of money. It's the logic of our politics today. Therefore, how do you safeguard the future against all those things? And how do you institute a system of rule of law, effective rule of law to prevent abuse of power so that public office is for public good? And once that incentive is gone, our behavior also alters. Look at Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister. At the prime of her life, at the age of 42, after 5.5 years of tenure, she gracefully said, I have no more fuel in the tank. I'm too exhausted as a person, as a human being, as a family member. Therefore, it's time for somebody else to take over leadership. Now, can you imagine that happening to a legislator, let alone to a prime minister or chief minister in India? Because we put so much store into the positions of power. We think that is our life at every level. If you are truly democratic, power is a responsibility. Power is a burden because instead of taking care of yourself, you're taking care of the society at enormous personal cost and family cost. In India, I don't think any person of the family feels that the person of the family is losing by power. In fact, they feel devastated when they lose power. They feel they have lost everything because power is everything. Power gives you money, power gives you privilege, power makes you corrupt. You can indulge in corruption as you please, power gives you abuse of authority, power gives you the heirs. So it's a much larger question. We have to build institutions and mechanisms to slowly, we cannot reach that ideal overnight, but slowly the legislator does her job well, executive does its job well, local governments do their job well, and the people are empowered, and ultimately power is for public service. I think we are very far from that idea.
So you have addressed three concerns that we'll be able to take care of if we switch over to separation of powers. But one of the things that I feel, please correct me if I'm wrong, that if the executive or if the leader of the state draws its power from their popularity, wouldn't it lead to more schisms in the polity, which is already too fractious?
As we discussed, Vritti, no system is perfect. But let's see what is happening. To look at what might happen, we must understand first what is happening. Are we in any serious doubt that Jayalalitha in Tamil Nadu or Stalin today, KCR in Telangana, or YS Jagan or Chandrababu Naidu in Andhra, or practically any leader in any state, are we any doubt that they are dictators in their respective states? Their word is law. So it's not that our current system is creating more humble leaders or creating genuine checks and balances in exercise of power. First, let's understand that. When we critique something and anticipate some dangers, first, where are we? Are we doing well? Is this going to be undermined? First of all, therefore, that's not an appropriate critique. The second is, as we discussed before, an elected governor of a state, directly elected governor of a state, exercising executive functions but having no automatic control over legislature, is weaker than the existing scheme of things, the Prime Minister or Chief Minister controlling a majority in Parliament, and therefore be assured of legislature always being with her, and anyway controlling the executive. Therefore, to think that if executive is separately elected, somehow it will be more tyrannical, less accountable, is not entirely true. Third, the jealousy. That's what the whole separation of powers doctrine is about. No organ of state wants another organ to be all powerful. If you can possibly do something about it. What is happening with the judiciary and the executive in the country today? Or in the United States? They're fighting, right? Some of it is healthy, some of it is unhealthy. But basically, it's about who is superior. If the same framework is available to legislature, that the government doesn't come from legislature, then they will also tend to actually fight a little bit. But it will not be so great that it will paralyze, because in our country, the general tendency is to go towards the executive, go towards who is wielding the executive power. That is the normal tendency. Therefore, I don't expect a schism between executive and legislature. But I think some amount of friction between the two is desirable, it's healthy for the country. But for this to work, if the head of the executive branch is also a party leader, and a party leader is supreme, there is dictatorship within the party, that's not going to help. Therefore, internal democracy within the parties and removal of this anti-defection law, these are two critical requirements for this system to work. Then, if the choice of candidates is by genuine democratic methods, members' choice or the elected delegates' choice, then there's a proper political recruitment. And if they are free to exercise their will about legislation and about budget, their voice is heard with respect and attention, then they will assert themselves and the executive will be under check. And finally, we must create a strong system of local governments. In fact, not only is it necessary for a strong and effective separation of powers, effective separation of powers makes it easier. Because right now, because MLA support is critical for the government's survival, you are not able to build strong local governments against the MLA's will. The moment you create local governments, MLA will say, why am I here? I'm spending so much money, because MLA is not looking at legislation and budget as his real powers or responsibilities. He's not looking at holding the government account as a responsibility. He's looking at local exercise of power as his responsibility. So you also separate that, because that becomes easier. An MLA cannot bring down a government. Now MLA can bring down a government, therefore no government is daring to violate the wishes of the MLA. So the system today is perverted. Those incentives must be re-altered, and we must clean up this system, but with accountability, to ensure that overall efficacy is there, because you must not throw the baby with the bathwater.
I agree with what you just said about, that going about with legislations with private member bill is not the way forward, because more or less it will be put down. It probably won't, go through.
Yeah, it will be buried.
But
I have no doubt that in India, if you go through that route, nothing happens.
Yeah, but see, efficiency of legislature is not just about how many laws have been passed. It's also about the number of laws or policies that have been discussed and debated. So with that, I have certain, number I'd like to talk about. In UK, 13 Fridays are chosen in a year, wherein on an average 5 hours of time is given to discussion on private members' bill. Whereas if that number has to be compared with India, I think the maximum time that was allotted for the discussion of private members' bill was between 2004 to 9, and that was 62 years. spread over 5 years, whereas in UK it is 65 years on an average every year. So leave about passing of the bills. It is also about the discussion and debate. Why do you think that we do not have that healthy discussion of bills sponsored by private members? They are seen like second grade legislators. Why do you think that is the case?
No, your point is right. But we must put it in the context when the legislature itself became irrelevant in the scheme of things, in popular imagination and in actual governmental functioning. A private member's bill, which is a subset of that, is obviously a casualty. Therefore, we must now enhance the power of the legislator, individually, and legislature collectively. That means a series of things. One, the practices within the legislature giving private members adequate space and time to ventilate their views. It may be views about a certain issue emerging in the country, it may be about a bill, it may be about something else. And on occasions, on rare occasions when we gave that opportunity, our legislatures actually functioned pretty well. I recall vividly in the last 15-20 years, two bills on which there was real debate in Parliament. One was the GST, constitutional amendment, the other was the Lokpal bill. I followed both of them very carefully. I'm sure many of our countrymen and women have followed them carefully. They were really rich debates, bringing out all the nuances and the complexity of the issue and trying to reconcile conflicting interests. But because in 15-20 years, these are the only two, we have to specially mention them. That should be the norm in every bill. Therefore, there is no question about it, parliamentary practice. But also removing the whip and the control of the party, because even if you allow a debate now in this country, with a whip and therefore your ability to say anything contrary to the government's view or your party boss's view, irrespective of facts and logic, if it's not there, then you are wasting time. Therefore, you must remove that. And the third is, in India, increasingly, the parliament and legislatures are not about debate and discussion. They're about how much of a noise you create, how much of interruption and disruption you have created, how many times you go into the well, how much you shout and walk out. Now, this is heinous. This is entirely in the hands of the legislature as long as the party leaders, they are willing to cooperate. Right now, everybody pays lip sympathy, but the party leaders want this to continue because that is how they control the whole process and the party. And finally, even if you do all these things, we will not really have improved functioning. Therefore, we have to look at political recruitment. How do we bring in the right kind of people through an electoral system that rewards competence, public spiritedness, and integrity? Right now, I don't think we can claim that because it's money power, it's the caste power, it is the patronage of a political leader that gives you the advantage, but not your qualities as a leader. Therefore, the electoral system that you have and the political recruitment model that we have. So it's unquestionably, within the legislature, there must be reforms, but there must be also reforms in the overall political culture, without which this will have only partial impact.
So you just mentioned that legislators make a lot of noise. There's a quote that says, I like the noise of democracy. Do you think that our legislators have taken it way too seriously?
It's cacophony instead of real voice. But no, there's another way we can do it. And in some respects at the parliamentary level, not adequately, but it's working a little better. Committee system. Right. Committee system. For instance, Woodrow Wilson, as the president during the First World War time, he said, Congress in session is Congress an exhibition. He was talking about the US Congress. As you know, both houses of the parliament, they call it Congress in the US, the elected houses of the federal legislature. In session is Congress an exhibition. Congress in committees is Congress at work. Always this exhibition part is about grandstanding, about getting media attention, about taking an extreme position so that people take note of you. If you make a reasoned, calm, dispassionate speech based on logic and evidence, people get bored, they switch off. If you shout on rooftops, take an extreme position, Hindu, Muslim, or caste system, or parties, or something else, then you are noticed. Unfortunately, it's also the media and our own citizenship or personal attention. You see what's happening in the media outside the legislatures. The more extreme and silly you are, the more noticeable you are. The more balanced and calm you are, the less noticeable you are. So because of these temptations, in the session world over, the quality is a little less than it is in the committees. But in other countries, because they have very strict rules about using that time and disciplining the members of the Congress who are erring, at least the conduct is civil, even if the quality is sometimes a little indifferent. But in committees, it's a little non-partisan, unhurried deliberation is possible, and the real discussion, going into the nuances and the depths of the issues, will more often happen in committees. Our committees are extremely weak. In Parliament, they're a little better, but even there, they're not really strong. Ultimately, it's the government's choice what to do. Committees can just advise. Whereas in the US, for instance, the committees are all powerful. We have to create committee system. In the states, in most states, committees, they virtually are non-existent. Perfunctorily on paper, they exist, but they're inconsequential.
I totally agree with you with regards to the importance of committees. And also not just the committees in India are weak, but also, they're not sufficient. They're not enough. And there's one data I was going through that from 2014 to 19, the number of laws that were, the bills per se were referred to the committees were nearly 25%. Whereas right now in this current Lok Sabha, that is 2019 to 24, the percentages of the bills that have to be referred to the committees has gone down to even 20%. So don't you see the situation to be very alarming?
No, I would not say alarming, but definitely unhealthy. After all, ultimately, the legislature is elected by the people. You command a majority in the legislature. Therefore, theoretically, you cannot question the legitimacy of a law made by the whole legislature. But the quality of debate is very disturbing. There's no question about it. No, but you must not always go by the percentages, because the large number of legislations are technical in nature. It is about one provision, some amendment because you found some difficulties at a point of time or new challenges emerging. Therefore, more than the percentage and numbers, I would like to go into the nature of legislation. If it's a real legislation, a new law being made or proposed, then unless there's an imminent threat to the country, there's an emergency, you cannot delay, you cannot wait. I think ideally it should be deliberated properly in the committee. And in India, while a significant number, 20-25% are sent, it certainly is not a majority. And there are some significant legislations that are not put through the legislature, even good legislations. The farm laws are a good example. If the farm laws, which are well intended, they're good laws, they're not sufficient, but they're necessary to liberate the agricultural markets from the clutches of the government and control Raj and license Raj. They're vital. If only they were debated and discussed in the committees. And if the minor disagreements are there, if you have created a process of reconciliation and some kind of a reasonable compromise without really undermining the purpose of the laws, India would have been better served. But by pushing them through the legislature without the committee system, the country lost. So I think even from a broader point of view of acceptability of legislation, it's in the interest of the people and the government to go through the committee system. Hurried thing is not a very good thing. Even however impatient you are to have a baby delivered, unless the baby actually grows in the womb for 280 days, if you pull the baby forcefully, oftentimes the mother and baby will be in danger. Legislation also is like that. You must give it a natural time and a process and be a little patient unless there's an imminent threat, unless there's an emergency.